So from around 1910 through the late 1930s, a lot of design was the inspiration was taken from two major modernist movements, which were Cubism as well as Futurism. And actually, the art of the poster wasn't being celebrated quite as much these days. So instead, a lot of things were influenced by the Dadaism and by the Cubism. And the book cites the example of this painting by Pablo Picasso called Majoli. What you'll see defining quote unquote modern art is that you're leaning now towards abstraction more than the narrative, more than the mythology, and people were trying to come up with very new and innovative ways of experimenting with how we're seeing the world and how we're seeing materials and different types of art function. The image was actually a woman holding a guitar, but the image was abstracted so much into different lines and angles and planes. We do see some shading here, but it's almost a shading of the two-dimensional planes rather than a shading of the figure. But so this is basically a fragmented image of the woman. This is very different from what we had been seeing, where the lines had previously been very deliberate and trying to capture a particular form. Image by the poet named Guillaume Apollinaire, and this type of artwork that he made were called calligrams. And what he was doing was actually taking the text, taking the lettering, and forming images out of the wording, so to have a sort of a visualization of the poetry. And something interesting about him was that he coined the words Orphism as well as Surrealism and Cubism to describe what was happening at the time. Orphism was a more abstract form with very bright colors. I'll show you an example in just a minute. Influenced by Fauvism, which is when you take colors that were not found in nature while still maintaining the same shading and all of that, but just taking different colors than an object would normally be and applying them to the image. So, maybe you'd see a tree that's made blue with red leaves rather than the traditional brown and green. So Apollinaire said that Cubism was a new manifestation in high art. It was not meant to constrain talent, and it was not meant to be symbolic, and it was supposed to be the opposite of commercial art. These artists did not want to have those same constraints. Published a book of these calligrams, which were collections of poetry where the typography and the layout would add to the entire image, to the entire effect, based on his experiences in the First World War. So yeah, he did several of these. And the way that these related to Cubism is that we're seeing the same type of fragmentation, only with text versus sections of the image. Apollinaire's terminology, Orphism, was created to describe the work of the painters Sonia Turk and Robert Delaunay. And this is one of her images, which was a collaboration with a French poet. So the word or Orphism came from the Greek myth of Orpheus, who was considered to be the ideal artist. He was also associated with mysticism. Sonia's work, along with her husband, was noted for its use of strong colors and geometric shapes. She was a painter, a textile designer, and a stage set designer. She was also the first living female artist to have a retrospective exhibition at the Louvre in 1964. And her work has a lot of influence from the artist Henri Matisse. Painters at this time would invoke classical music when they were painting because they thought it kind of reflected well on the abstract forms used in this type of artwork. So Sonia did a lot of collaborations with the poet Blaise Cendrars, And this was sort of a combination of the modernist word with the paintings itself, and you can kind of see how she incorporated the painting into the text to sort of take up the same spaces. 7 feet long, and the image that I'm showing you is the last part of it, where it's basically counting a train ride that the poet took. So it's a poem about travel. And the poem isn't very linear. It goes back and forth time-wise, and so the way that the painting is kind of swirling around and kind of abstract sort of signifies the feeling of what the poem is trying to convey rather than illustrate what it's referring to. And a portion of it, actually the entire image, wound up almost resembling train tracks with its length and the amount of different sections that it contained. So, the way a lot of artists stayed employed was to make posters for the London Underground, and a lot of them used aspects of Cubism to make that a reality. In 1890, the first electric underground railway in Europe, the City and South London Railway, was completed, and it became more and more successful. But the Central London Railway wound up being very successful because of its price and due in part to its advertising. Consolidation of the underground lines in the Central London Railway was known as the Underground Group, and this group was faced with making a trademark for the group. So this image here, the red circle with the text in the middle with a blue background with white text, became its defining image. So this was going to be the design standard that the rest of the underground group's work followed. In 1922, Edward McKnight Kauffer was an established poster designer for the underground, and he was given a lot of freedom in his designs, and he kind of did a mixture of sort of the Japanese printmaking, the sac plaquette style, and sort of the analytical cubism that we've been seeing. So he's sort of maybe disappointed some of the cubists in that he did do commercial art. He didn't really stand for the anti-commercialism that the rest of the people in the movement had sort of hoped to celebrate. But he did attempt to do some really interesting things here. So you can see in the text where it says underground, he has sort of this interplay between two-dimensional and three-dimensional lettering depending on how you look at it. So as you're staring at the image, your eyes kind of go in and out between this effect. So he definitely used a lot of these modernist principles in his artwork and kind of made it a little bit more palatable for the viewer. I thought it was kind of cute that he's representing going to different sales, and this is sort of a timeless activity that has endured throughout the years, and this is something that was definitely motivating people to go ahead and use the transit system. This image by Austin Cooper called It's Warmer Down Below, where you can see sort of an amalgamation of the cubism. In fact, you can see this embodiment in the sense that there is fire coming up, but the fire is made out of these cubes, these squares, which sort of provide a shimmering or lightning effect to the image. Provide a contrast between Harry Beck's version of a London Underground map and what it actually looked like when people were sort of trying to map out the intricacies and sort of, capture this intertwining route, but it didn't look organized. It looked almost like a nightmare when you see the first iteration versus what he was able to come up with. And if you go to any underground station today, the CTA in Chicago, for example, you'll see something that looks very similar to this. So this has definitely had a lasting impact on the design world. Beck used a very small number of symbols, and he did not need a super complex key. It was very color-coded, and not only that, it did have an aesthetic appeal. So there was sort of a nice interplay between form and function for his version of the map. The only potential issue was that it didn't show adequate distances between the stops. Everything on the points was equidistant to each other, so it didn't really show as much of a scale, so it was a bit radical for the time period.